Welcome back, you all, to CHD 204, and I'm happy that you've joined me for another week of methods and materials for teaching young children. This week, we're going to discuss the objectives associated with Chapter 7, the Writing Center. Up until recently, writing centers were really not found real often in early childhood classrooms. The children weren't expected to learn to write until they were in primary school. They may learn to print or write their names, but that was really all. And in the terms of literacy, we were only kind of concerned with reading and not so much with writing, or so we thought. So as literacy analysts began to study reading and writing, they came to the conclusion that reading and writing they develop simultaneously, and they're very interrelated or interconnected, okay? And helping children emerge into writing in the preschool also helps them emerge into reading. We've thought for years that learning to write was some kind of mysterious process, and no one really understood how children learn to write. But it appeared that we learned to write at least as much by discovery as we were actually formally taught. And so we also have decided that learning to write is largely an act of discovery. That if we put the material out there and we expose children to writing in a print-rich classroom, then through natural discovery, they're just going to learn the writing process. So join me as we learn all about the Writing Center in a self-directed classroom and what role it plays in teaching young children. I'm going to kind of go through these objectives. You can see those there on your PowerPoint, okay? So here's what we just talked about. Learning to write is largely an act of discovery, and they develop simultaneously, and they're interconnected. You will really talk a lot about this in CHD 203 as well, about the reading and writing process and how important that is, and how we'll go even deeper into that interconnected part, okay? So, just as learning to read can develop naturally with young children in a print-rich environment, so can learning to write. And so what we've learned is that in emergent literacy, like we discussed in Chapter 5, refers to both reading and writing as abilities that emerge naturally when children are surrounded by reading and writing activities at home and in the preschool setting, where they are encouraged to interact with them playfully. And until recently, we rarely paid attention to the pre-writing skills that young children have always displayed from infancy on. When they scribbled on paper or on frosted windows or even in the mud, we just kind of dismissed it as nothing really important, like doodling kind of, just merely something that they did before they could draw, just like babbling is to what children do before they could talk. But now we know so much better. The more evidence of emerging writing researchers looked for, the more they found. And they first kind of looked at the scribbling and realized that all scribbling wasn't the same, okay? And that infants scribbled differently than toddlers different than preschoolers, and so on. And they moved from just random scribbles to controlled scribbles, to mock letters and words, and then finally to real writings and real drawings, okay? And what we also learned is that children know what they're doing. You can point to their scribbles and ask them, and they can, and as they progress through that natural process, they can tell you exactly what it is what that drawing is. Even though to you it just looks like random scribbles, they can tell you exactly what the drawing is, and then even their words as well. So they can read their scribbles for sure. One of the things we know too is that in order for children to develop in this natural progression of writing, we've got to display their environment with examples of words, print, any kind of written down talk that they draw. So like if they draw something, they scribble it, and they tell us what it says, we need to write below it and hang it up so that they can see it. Display it, okay? Because the best way to promote it is for them to see it in their daily environment, okay? Setting up a writing center And so we're going to talk a little about that, but we have to encourage and support their scribbling and their, in order for them to move into writing, okay? So what does writing in the preschool classroom look like? First of all, it's got to be print rich, okay? And we discussed also in chapter 5 that when we were talking about print rich and classroom, we talked about it in chapter 5, but it's equally in the writing area as well, okay? Environmental print, which if you look in your book, you'll see on table 1.7 a list of what environmental print is, but it's so important in children's development of writing. The items that you see on that table 7.1 are things that they see in their surroundings naturally, and they contain lots of rich contextual clues. They illustrate to children that print is actually symbolic. It stands for something. And remember that having a print-rich environment makes it easier for the children to learn to write, okay, because it's all around them and they see it in their daily environment. So how are we going to set up our writing center? One thing we want to make sure is that we put it near, like maybe the book center or the listening center, so that those two things can, so what they listen to, they can go up to the writing center and write about, or something they read about in the reading center, they could go up to the writing center and write about it, okay? So they can kind of, those activities can spill over between those 2 or 3 centers. So once you've decided about the location of your classroom, you're going to need to make sure that your writing center contains several things. A child-sized desk, okay? Lots of different writing and printing tools and sets of letters. And when we talk about sets of letters, we're talking about like magnetic letters, plastic letters, maybe sandpaper letters that they can actually fill, and they're very tactile so that they can trace over those letters and feel how to make them. But one thing we do want to avoid is actually having letters that they trace, because we want them to, we want the writing center to be where they use their writing, and not necessarily that they're tracing those letters, okay? A sand table. I thought that was a wonderful idea that your book suggested, because they can smooth out the sand and actually form the letters that way. Child-sized mailboxes, making sure that you have colorful posters with pictures and labels. One thing like having your shelves labeled, we talked about that way back in the block center. Remember the chapter on the block center? We talked about having those the shelves labeled. Okay, and then of course having an alphabet freeze, you know, from A to Z in both capital letters or uppercase letters and in lowercase letters. So having those letters hanging up on in and near the writing center as a reference for the children. We talked a little bit about this too, about random scribbling, controlled scribbling, name scribbling, mock letters. All we really want to do here is make sure that you take it seriously, okay? That teachers take their scribbling and their mock writing seriously. It's an important part of the natural progression of emergent writing and should be dated and saved in their portfolio, because the nice thing about it is it shows you their progression. How a child moves from that random scribbling, if you're saving that work and putting it together in a portfolio. So not only does it show you as the teacher the milestones that they're reaching, but it also shows their parents that progression, okay? But of course it moves from random to controlled to named and then to mock, okay? One thing that we want to make sure of though is that a lot of times, and I know this, I had an example of this when I taught first grade of this happening. But one thing is that we think a lot of times that we should teach children the alphabet so that they can put the letters together to make the words. And actually that's kind of wrong. And that's really not how it works. Studies tell us that young children learn to write through a process that is really just the opposite. What research tells us is that children attend first to the whole, okay, like the whole sentence, the written lines, and only much later do they move to those individual parts like the letters, okay? So it's no wonder in all these years that we got the writing process backwards, that we taught it backwards, because we thought we needed to teach those letters first And then we teach them how to write the words when actually they go from the large to the whole. I mean, from the large whole to the small pieces, okay? So really all they need is a few letters, which leads us to this leads us to this slide right here. What are the first letters that children are aware of? The letters in their name. Okay, so that goes to show us right there that they only need a few letters. They only know and recognize a few letters in order to write, and then it just kind of takes off. Okay, so their names are those first things that they become aware of. Children first perceive print as kind of lines, and later with their progression recognize the divisions in the lines are actually the words, okay? And still later they recognize that words are made up of letters. The first letters they recognize are often those in their own names. And so we want to make sure that we use and we read books to children that feature names, okay? They're going to form letters upside down, backward, some up here in their writing, some down below in their writing, and that's okay. We should just appreciate it, the process over the product, okay? And accept it, hang it up, and display it because it's part of their natural progression. If you will look on page, I'm sorry, hold on just a second, I lost the page. If you'll look on page 151 in your book, you'll see some an offering of books that feature names. And so you can see what that kind of looks like, okay? Now, learning certain alphabet letters is an important accomplishment for preschool children on their road to emergent writing. Okay, but let's talk about these cognitive development and how writing helps to promote their cognitive development. For preschool children, the recognition and naming of letters are cognitive concepts related to their future reading achievement. However, there is some controversy regarding whether or not the actual teaching of the alphabet to preschoolers is really appropriate. We realize that children can learn to read, and guess what? They can learn to read without knowing the names of the letters. Some people will argue with that. But when you read the word, let's take the very first bullet on here. The word is have on your slide. Do you need to know that that is H-A-V-E, or do you need to know that that word is have, and that H says never once do you name H-A-V-E have. And that was the example when I taught first grade. I had a child who, and I was, went to several trainings. I had some children that were really struggling learning to read. And that's one of the things that the presenter told me is you're concentrating too much on them learning the names of the letters when we really need to focus on, they don't have to know the letters to know how to read. It's okay if they mix up a certain letter as long as they know that sound and they know that word, okay, as we moved on further. So NAEYC states that preschool children need access to the alphabet, but memorizing all 26 letters of the alphabet just isn't necessary. They don't have to memorize all those. Some people believe that children can learn their letters of the alphabet by singing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And you may hear people say, oh, my baby knows all their letters. And they know their alphabet because they can sing the ABC song. But that's false. They're just singing a song. Doesn't mean that you know the letters of the alphabet, okay? Computer alphabet programs are things that you can use, and you can see some of these other ideas. Alphabet books, I love alphabet books. And on page 151, you'll see some alphabet books listed in your textbook, okay? Of course, physical development. We know that when you are writing those fine motor skills that, you know, you got it. Babies instantly, they do this grip here. And then they move to that more controlled grip, okay, when they're writing. One thing I've seen people do is adding different types of writing tools, one at a time, okay? Wet chalk activities. Finger painting is another great idea. I've seen people take a bag, a Ziploc bag of finger paint, and then put it in a larger Ziploc bag of finger, and close it up. So the finger paint's in one bag, drop down into another Ziploc bag, sealed up, and maybe some duct tape over it where it won't leak, and they can actually form those letters, okay? Paper punchers, anything to stimulate their interest, okay? And then, and if you're punching, what are you doing? You're using those fine motor skills, okay? They can write thank you notes to each other to help social development. Individual mailboxes where they write their friends letters, okay? They can sign their names to take turns. All that interactive writing where children are involved in the writing process with one another or in small groups with their teacher is ways to promote that social development. And of course, I said already, reading and writing go hand in hand in language, so it's definitely going to be promoting their language development, okay? One thing to think about with language development is they can make lists, okay? Let them make lists. Let them journal. Put out several different punches and let them do that. Wordless picture books in 203 will really go into a lot of this about language development, and we'll read wordless picture books and share what those are all about and involving them in that storytelling and that story reading process and how that can then turn and go into writing. Make sure that you are accommodating your dual language learners, okay? And most of the time they can write before they can master spoken language, okay? So we'll want to make sure that we have some of those bilingual books in the classroom as well. Your role is to observe and guide them through the process, okay, wherever they are. And you're going to use the Writing Center, promote the Writing Center, offer children that might not necessarily be engaging in the Writing Center, give them a direct invitation to the Writing Center, and you get in there and help encourage them to actually use it, okay? And that is the end. Thank you for joining me for Chapter 7, the Writing Center.